Gospel, a unique harmony of the Christian Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We're going to talk about why, how, and so what. This is Heath and Holly. So why study Jesus? Why study Jesus, Holly?
Because it's important.
Okay. We could follow the slide, too. It says
His historical
significance. That's one reason.
His cultural significance.
Right. You may have noticed that Western society is somewhat influenced by him.
His spiritual significance.
Yeah, this is actually what matters on a personal level.
His personal significance.
Yes. Whether or not he means something to you, me. He means something to me. How about you, Holly?
He means the world to me.
Aw. So, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 writers, one story, right? That sounds simple, doesn't it?
Like pie.
Simple like pie. Okay. So, in front of you, you see what a traditional harmony of the Gospels looks like, where they just basically put the text in parallel. So, you see Matthew 28 on your left, Mark 16 to the right, Luke 24 to the right, John 20 to the right. They're all talking about the first day of the week when the women and then later the disciples went to the empty tomb and interacted with angels and the risen Jesus. So a lot of times, people can read one, but that's not really what we're doing here with One Gospel. Instead, we're trying to put it together, make it one continuous narrative where we're being true to each source, but we're also making it a plausible sequence of events, and we're presenting it in a fuller way than the individual writers gave to us. Now, this is not the first time anyone's ever tried to do this. The first one was actually in 160 AD. That was a long time ago, wasn't it, Holly?
Extremely.
So, Tatian wrote something called the Diatessaron. Now, he did not try to exactly follow the chronology of the events. So, he kind of skipped around a little, or a lot, depending how you look at it. And he would just basically choose one. So, like for that last example I gave you where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John both talked about the same thing, he would have just chosen one and then potentially added some of the other keywords or phrases from the others, but that's more plus or minus. He would just stick to one account for each individual event that was unique. And he included everything in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, except for the genealogies, which are found in Matthew and Luke, and the account of the adulterous woman in the Gospel of John. What do you think about that, Holly?
Very interesting.
Indeed. So this visually shows you how it's different. So you see here, the tomb is found empty by the women early on the first day of the week. You see the same scripture references, Matthew 28, Mark 16, Luke 24, and John 20. But you can see visually that it's just one continuous story, and it's color-coded. So if you have the color key, which I don't have on this particular slide, you can know that, for example, dark green is Matthew and Mark combined, and black is all 4, and dark blue is just Matthew, and dark red is just Luke, as an example. Now, this was a work in process. Creating what I would call a plausible chronology of the events. This particular sequence was very challenging, and I didn't really have a good working chronology for a long, long time. However, I really don't want to distort any of the individual sources, so I even if something's awkward, I'm going to keep it. And I just think that is being fair to each of the sources because I deeply respect them. So, why would somebody do this? Why would someone do this, Holly?
Because you can compare the Gospels and know the whole story.
I'll take that as a good answer. The individual events recounted by more than one gospel can be described more fully in a way no individual gospel did. So that particular sequence of events, the first morning of that Sunday morning when the women found the tomb empty, you're at least reading a plausible account of everything that happened according to the four sources. Teaching sequences. So, for example, the Sermon on the Mount. There's overlap between Matthew and Luke, and you can see a more fuller, extensive teaching. You can see the full context of everything that was said, at least that we know about. The journey of Jesus' disciples and his opposition, meaning the Pharisees and Sadducees, can be better described and understood because you can see how these relationships and these journeys evolved over time. And this is a recurring theme, Holly.
Mm-hmm.
If God gave us the components, didn't God also give us the whole?
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's more. Studying the pieces gives insight into how the Gospels were written and how they influenced each other. Studying the differences between parallel sequences. So, if Matthew and Mark both talk about the same thing, looking at the differences, it actually implies the fidelity of the transmission of the individual Gospels. And why do you think that is, Holly?
Well, I think that it just shows kind of, you can look at the commonalities, but also the differences in terms of, who they were talking to and, who was present during those things that you're talking about.
So, yes, but the fidelity of the transmission. Can you actually trust what you have today as being something that was faithfully transmitted? Because there's differences between the Gospels, that actually helps you trust them. Because if a scribe wants to cover up the differences between them, they know the differences. They're spending their lives copying them, right? They could just, change it. They could, quote unquote, fix the mistakes. I'm not saying right now there are mistakes, but I'm just saying someone could look at the differences and say, well, this is going to undermine people's faith, or, just as a propaganda effort, I don't want there to be any differences at all between any of the Gospels. And so, a central power, such as the Roman Empire, you may have heard of the Roman Empire, the scriptorium in Constantinople is where we got a lot of our ultimate, that was the major place where the copying took place, where we have our the versions we have today. They went through there.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
They could have changed it, but they didn't. And they didn't because they knew that was wrong, and it's because they trusted God as the source, and they didn't want to mess with that.
Yeah, I was thinking more or less about just human error, and that also not everybody is present for every story or interviewed the same people. So I was just thinking you would have sometimes different things reported, also your point of view as well, and recollection. But the idea that, there's fidelity because it's constantly translated the same way over and over again, that's a really good point.
Thank you. The other thing about studying parallel passages is that you can show what words or phrases were substituted for each other. So, for example, you could see that the word Satan is interchangeable with the devil. I know that sounds like a very obvious one, but there are plenty of examples where you can look at these parallel passages and you can see sort of just the Bible's telling you what things are connected. And, like there are times where Jesus says that I'm going to be giving you a message, and he says elsewhere, the Holy Spirit will be giving you the message. But it's the same parallel passage. Well, that tells you something about theology, doesn't it, Holly?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it does. So, again, if God gave us these components, as long as we don't alter them, did he not also give us the whole?
Absolutely.
But there's more. So we can look at how did Jesus' prophecies intersect. A lot of people that are into, studying Bible prophecy, they tend to focus on just a few specific chapters in the Bible, but there's actually a lot of things that intersect, and it's worth looking at. How do his mystical teachings intersect? He says a lot of things that are, I don't know, they don't tell you about in Sunday school, but
kind of wild.
Yes, and they are worth exploring. How do the Gospels quote the quote-unquote Old Testament, both the Hebrew and the Greek? Sometimes they quote the Hebrew version, sometimes they quote the Greek version, sometimes they quote some hybrid. That the Bible is telling you, by studying it, how it looks at itself and how you should look at it. And I just said that. How the writings of the apostles, so, the letters that were written after the time of Jesus, how do they intersect with the Gospels? How do they use sometimes they quote it, but most of the time it's not quoting. Most of the time it's just expanding on ideas. And again, if God gave us the components, did he not also give us the whole? And there's more. We look at the textual variants of the Gospels. Holly was talking about error, scribal error. Sure, human beings are not going to, for each individual copy, make perfect copies. That's true. And we rely on the majority text, but we look at all of the ancient variants and note them. How do the Gospels compare with other descriptions of first century Judaism? So, there's plenty of other writings out there. Dead Sea Scrolls, there's Philo, Josephus. Then there's later Jewish writings like the Talmud, which supposedly reflect first century Judaism. How do the Gospels compare with other Jewish writings that preceded them? So we're not just talking about the Old Testament. We're talking about the books that didn't make the Bible, like Enoch, or the Book of Jubilees. There's lots of them. Those are just two prominent examples. How do the Gospels compare with or, how do they intersect with modern science, archaeology, and classical history? And how do the Gospels compare with other religions, including alternative Gospels, which there's lots of interesting comparisons there, and just other interpretations of Jesus, like the Quran, or other things, like the Book of Mormon, right?
Yep.
Book of Mormon talks about this time too. Now, God gives us the truth, but I'm not claiming that all these other things are equal. I mean, the truth will bear itself out, and everything that is truthful does come from God, but of course not everything is of God. And our job is to faithfully stick with what is true. So this is not an intellectual exercise for me. I hope it is not an intellectual exercise for you. It's not an apology. I'm not trying to just desperately, defend things that, people use to attack it, like when they talk about differences and mistakes, and they talk about scribal errors and blah blah blah. I'm not trying to defend the Bible. The Bible doesn't need to be defended. I am just seeking the truth. I'm not, when I started this, I had no end point. I'm still not sure what the end point is. We just make videos. Ooh, yeah, we're getting rich because we're not selling anything or asking for money. Again, I can't even say it's finished. I'm looking at verb tenses right now. I'm not done. But I will say this is an honest effort. I'm not propagandizing you, and I'm not deliberately trying to push a theology on you. I never took a class on religion in my life, and I don't represent a school or a teacher. I mean, I'm a member of a Christian community, but I don't represent them either.
I've taken many classes, but I don't attest to any of that.
She is a product of Catholic education. She's a nice lady, too. I'm glad I'm married to her. We're having our anniversary in a few days. And this is a gift. Freely I was given, freely I give. Hopefully you get something out of it. So, how did I make this? Because, you can look at the playlist now. We have version 1, 2, 3, and 4 up. So I would invite you to listen to the actual gospel. But I do think our rambling has some value. So there's two major types of decisions to create a harmony. What sequence did the major events come in? Within a major event, how are the words of different gospels combined? What is the order of the sub-events within the major event? What is the order of the spoken elements? What non-identical words can be combined and what should remain separate? And then there are innumerable minor decisions that need to be made. Word choice when more than one is reasonable, proper noun spelling, punctuation,
etc., etc.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. It's like a lot. So we'll start with how do we sequence the major events. I'm not going to go through every detail of decisions, though. I want to give you the big picture so you can kind of understand what is it and why does it exist, this unique gospel harmony. So there's only a couple events really that are found in all four gospels. Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist. He feeds the 5,000. And then basically we're at the end of his life. His triumphal entry into Jerusalem, the final Passover meal with his disciples when he was arrested, his trial before the high priest, his interrogation by Pilate, his crucifixion, and then the tomb is found empty, and Jesus appears to the women early on the first day of the week. So those things are the only things that all 4 Gospels have, so they provide what I would call an anchor as far as the chronology. Furthermore, if you look at just his final week in Jerusalem, that's nearly 50% of the Gospels is anchored by that event, because he had a journey to Jerusalem, then his last days in Jerusalem, and then his post-resurrection appearances. Additionally, the events up through Jesus' childhood don't need an anchor either, because it's obvious where they happen. You know, he was born, John the Baptist was born, Jesus was 12 years old in the temple. So that takes a chunk of the early parts of the Gospels as well, but that still leaves a lot. The other half of the Gospels are anchored by John the Baptist, because there was a time when John and Jesus interacted, because John wasn't in prison yet. There was a time where John was in prison, but he wasn't dead yet. Then he died. So there's a time after he died. And then, of course, after he died, then leads into the final journey to Jerusalem. Luke doesn't say within his narrative when John is imprisoned. He does mention his execution, but because Matthew and Mark do, and Luke has parallel passages with Matthew and Mark, we can confidently place the other sections of Luke. So that's Luke 4:14 through 9:6. That only leaves us with John 4 and 5, actually. And John 4 it falls between the time of John the Baptist's ministry and the feeding of the 5,000. So John 4 really is comfortably placed right at the time, right before John was arrested. John 5 is at least reasonably placed after Jesus sent out the 12 apostles and before they came back to him. So that's the big picture. It's really just a couple events can anchor it, but of course it's the details that's the hard part. And that gives you an outline, but how are the words of each gospel sequenced and combined into one gospel? But of course, even more importantly, what do the passages tell us? It's the message of the truth that's more important. So that takes a lot of episodes to explain if we were to go through each decision, which I'm pretty positive we're not. But, before examining the details, of the actual decisions, I would urge you to at least watch the big picture, because it's really it's a compelling story. Not because of me, but because of the sources. So what? If you're willing to explore what the Bible reveals about itself in an honest fashion, and what it says about Jesus through these 4 Christian Gospels, stay tuned and we'll keep talking about it. They've changed me a lot. It's really deepened my faith. So it means something to me, but, really, it's very easy, especially when you're getting into details, to just make this an intellectual exercise. But the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, facilitated the writing and really the transmission of the Gospels. So if that's the author, I would urge you to seek his wisdom as we contemplate the gospel, which is good news, together. So coming up next, we're going to talk about continuity
and truth.
And truth. Thank you.